Welcome to the moment when every engine died at once. 12 armored trucks, full convoy formation, steel humming under the weight of night, and then silence absolute and crushing swallowed the valley whole. It was March 1944, eastern France near the river Moselle. Cold mist coiling through pine and shattered barns. The 11th Armored returning from the front. They called it a regrouping maneuver on paper, a tactical retreat in whispers. But that night it became something else entirely. A column of light and fog, a command voice on radio, and then nothing. No static, no echo, not even the clatter of tracks on gravel. Just one fading hum and the sound of breath caught in the throat of a dozen men who realized too late that their world had stopped moving. They said the general was standing up through the hatch of the lead vehicle binoculars, raised scanning ahead, a shape in moonlight framed by fog engine exhaust, burning pale blue around him. Then the lead truck rolled forward into cloud and disappeared like a match blown out. The second vehicle hesitated, called command no response. The third braked turret turning machine gun aimed at nothing but smoke. When the mist broke 20 seconds later, there was only the road and the long metallic echo of engines cooling down, clicking, ticking, whispering. Soldiers at the rear swore they still heard the general's voice crackle on the radio, half of a sentence distorted. Maintain formation, and then the line bled out into static. The convoy commander, a lieutenant barely 27, slammed the transmitter yelling for coordinates. He never got an answer. One by one, the vehicles powered down, not by order, not by damage, as if the will to move had been switched off somewhere in the air. Minutes stretched. The fog thickened. The stars vanished. What they could see instead were faint outlines of steel bodies, the convoy frozen mid-turn gun barrels pointing outward like petrified limbs. No one dared open a hatch. The silence wasn't peaceful, it pressed alive like something listening. When they finally dared to move, one driver cracked open his door, the sound of hinges scraped the air like a scream. He stepped down boots into mud and shouted toward the lead truck. No echo. The valley swallowed his voice whole. The lieutenant followed pistol-drawn flashlight beam, cutting a path through white haze until they reached the point where the general's vehicle should have been. The tire marks ended abruptly, ground frozen, unbroken beyond that line. No debris, no tracks, no oil. It was as if the front of the convoy had been erased mid-motion. Back at command, the log entry was brief, convoy alpha radio, lost presumed delayed. No one filed a missing report for 48 hours. By then, the war had already shifted east. Front lines moved like tides, erasing yesterday's errors before anyone could question them. Yet in the barracks, the men who returned from that valley refused to speak above a whisper. They said the road itself had gone quiet that every night after. When a truck drove past, that stretch, the engine sputtered, headlights dimmed, and radios filled with that same distorted voice. Maintain formation breaking off exactly the way it had that night. One mechanic from the motor pool claimed he found burn marks shaped like handprints on the steel hull of the rearmost vehicle. Another swore the metal was colder inside than out, like the heat had been drained away. They tried to test it. Thermometers fogged over, cameras jammed. A war correspondent later wrote it off as exhaustion, combat stress hallucination. Maybe. But the convoy manifest listed 12 trucks, 43 men, 1 commanding general, and only 31 returned. 12 names were erased, not killed, not captured, just removed from the roll with the phrase status unknown. In the weeks that followed, strange orders came down, the surviving drivers reassigned to different units separated by hundreds of miles. The lieutenant who led them was transferred to logistics, no combat, no further field duty. His after-action report was sealed, marked incomplete. Decades later, when the archives were declassified, that page was missing. Only the title remained, Incident at Mile 72. People say the valley's still there, paved now, lined with trees that never shed bark. Truckers on the night route claim their CB radios crackle near the bend, a voice giving coordinates in a language no one can trace. The steel guardrail along that stretch has been replaced 3 times. Corrosion officials say, though the locals call it, the metal that remembers. And maybe that's the strangest part. Steel isn't supposed to remember. It bends, breaks, melts, but it doesn't whisper names, unless something inside it refuses to let go. Unless what vanished that night was more than a convoy, maybe it was time itself folded into its own echo. Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and the exact second you felt the silence settle. Because tonight, as you listen, that same road still exists somewhere in the dark, waiting for engines that will never start again, waiting for a general who never came back, waiting for the sound of steel remembering. March 1944, Eastern France. The official record states that the 11th Armored Division was performing a tactical withdrawal along the Moselle corridor. Nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual, just another night in a war that had already learned how to consume its own noise. The convoy's route ran between Metz and Pont-à-Mousson, a stretch of valley road lined with pine forests and blackened ruins. Rain had passed earlier that evening, leaving the ground slick and glistening like old oil. The men were tired 3 days without proper sleep, 2 without a warm meal, and yet the general insisted on traveling with them, not ahead in command cars, not by air, but inside the convoy itself. Witnesses remembered it as an act of solidarity. Others later said it was something else, a habit of control, a refusal to delegate even the most mechanical aspects of command. Either way, he boarded the lead truck shortly before 2200 hours. Within an hour, the column disappeared. In military dispatches, the general's name was redacted. Every surviving page replaced his identity with a code name Unit Lead A. The convoy's purpose was marked supply recovery. But cross-reference that with fuel logs and ammunition manifests, and the numbers do not match. They weren't retrieving supplies, they were transporting something. Crates marked with an R-17 designation, sealed under 3 layers of wax, escorted by a signals officer whose orders came directly from G2 intelligence. Those crates were never found. The road itself was known as Route D157, a narrow 2-lane artery cutting through low hills. It was a choke point perfect for an ambush, perfect for disappearance. Locals had already fled months before. The only light came from the occasional farmhouse still smoldering from artillery. Every 15 minutes, the convoy was required to report status by radio. The final confirmed transmission came at 22:46. The signals officer reported visibility, low fog, density rising, but progress steady. The general's voice can be heard faintly in the background, he says. We'll make the bridge by midnight. Then silence. At 22:59, a 2nd Division stationed 14 kilometers north detected a short-range flare. Blue light rising, then extinguished halfway through ascent. The field log lists it as unidentified ordnance. No follow-up. At 23:07, telephone relay from Metz received static on Channel 5, a phrase cut mid-sentence, possibly formation or information. After that, the record ends. What happened in those 11 minutes between radio loss and the first recovery team's arrival remains unaccounted for. A search party dispatched at dawn found only 9 vehicles. Engines cold, hatches open, ammunition untouched. The men who remained alive could not remember the same sequence of events. One driver claimed the fog glowed white and his instruments failed. Another said his truck stopped as if an invisible hand held it still. A gunner described hearing metallic footsteps along the roof. When he looked up through the hatch, there was nothing but frost forming where breath should have been. Their watches had stopped too, each one frozen at 22:54. The general's body was never recovered. No blood, no torn fabric, no shell marks. His cap was found 2 miles away, resting upright on a stone wall. No tracks led to it. The military police photographed it, logged it, sealed it into evidence. 2 weeks later, the photo vanished from the file. The negatives were labeled compromised. In its place, a note in typewriter ink, expunged per Command Directive 404. Years later, a historian from the Ministry of Defense requested access to the convoy's logbooks. He was denied. Not because they didn't exist, but because the entire batch of March 1944 movement records was listed as destroyed in an accidental fire. The fire report itself, dated June 1946, contains no witness signatures. Just an unsigned line reading, "Materials compromised, containment necessary." The historian, frustrated, sent a private letter to his colleague. "There's a pattern here. Missing trucks, redacted generals, sealed evidence, and always the same explanation: fog." He never published again. The terrain where the convoy vanished was surveyed in 1953 by engineers building a new supply route. Their notes describe magnetic anomalies in the soil. Compass needles veered east when placed near the old road. Equipment malfunctioned. Cameras overexposed in low light. One technician recorded engine noise at exactly 22:54 each night, though the site was empty. Locals called it the returning sound. They told stories of seeing headlights flicker in the mist, moving in perfect formation, then dissolving before dawn. For decades, survivors of the 11th Armored were interviewed, though few agreed to speak on record. One Corporal René Morel testified under oath in 1958. He didn't vanish like a man shot or taken. It was like the world folded around him. The fog turned solid. I remember the sound like metal crying, and then it all stopped. His testimony was later stricken from the record as psychological disturbance due to combat fatigue. Morel died in 1961 in a small veterans hospital outside Lyon. In his personal notebook found years later by his family, one final line was underlined twice. The steel remembers what we are not allowed to. In 1979, a journalist for WWII tried to reconstruct the event using declassified archives. He tracked down one of the engineers who worked the 1953 survey. The man refused to speak on tape, but allowed a brief conversation off record. He said the ground under Route D-157 was unstable not geologically, but electrically. The phrase electrical fog appeared in his notes. He showed the journalist a fragment of metal recovered from the site, burned black edges curled like paper. Its serial number matched one of the missing trucks. The fragment emitted a low hum when struck with a pen. The journalist described it as a sound like breath inside steel. That article never ran. The paper withdrew it the night before printing, citing pressure from higher authorities. The editor resigned 2 days later. When the journalist tried to retrieve his notes, the entire archive folder had been removed. Only the headline proof remained 3 words typed in bold, "The convoy that never came back." In the years that followed, the story became less fact and more folklore. Veterans told it in mess halls as a cautionary tale about the night a general tested fate, about how silence can be louder than war itself. But before it turned to myth, there were still numbers, coordinates, bearings, timestamps, all pointing to something that happened at 22:54 on March 12, 1944. And so the file remained open, an absence shaped like evidence. The ministry refused comment. The valley was renamed, and every few years, when a researcher dug too deep, another containment memo appeared. The pattern repeated: new paper, same fog. The kind that swallows not only men and machines, but memory itself. Before we move on, if you're still listening, mark the time on your screen, the minute your chest tightened or the room seemed quieter. Write it in the comments. Because these stories are never just about the past. They're about what we hear when history tries to speak again, and what answers back when steel remembers. The report began with 2 words, status unknown. That's how they described an entire convoy that stopped breathing. The official memo, typed on thin military paper, carried the smell of oil and smoke. It said the general's column had halted due to radio failure and mechanical malfunction. But every mechanic who examined those engines swore they were intact, untouched, perfect, ready to start at any moment. The problem wasn't the machines, it was the silence between them. At dawn, the recovery team arrived. Frost covered every surface, the steel shining faintly, like it was sweating light. The truck stood in formation, neat, obedient, empty. The doors were open, weapons still mounted. In the lead vehicle, the general's command car, the driver's seat was warm, but no one was there. His map case lay on the dashboard, unzipped pages fluttering without wind. The radio light was still on a single green pulse, repeating the last frequency code again and again, a heartbeat without a body. They photographed everything. Each picture came out with a faint double image, a shadow of the same truck slightly displaced, as if the camera captured 2 moments overlapping. When developed, the negatives emitted a faint hum like current still running through steel. The archive officer who handled them described the sensation as a vibration that climbs into your wrist. The photos were labeled Incident 72, then sealed. Witness statements contradicted each other. One corporal said the general climbed out of the hatch and vanished in the fog like a man walking into glass. Another insisted he was inside the truck speaking on the radio until the transmission cut off mid-word. The last soldier to see him alive was a young driver from Lyon. He told investigators he looked calm, too calm, like he was listening to something outside the engines. The driver's report was signed, filed, and later marked retracted. He never served again. Inside the second truck, investigators found something stranger: handprints on the interior steel wall. Perfectly formed, pressed deep into the metal, as if the surface had softened under enormous pressure. Metallurgists tested the alloy normal composition, no heat deformation. Yet the prints existed. The report called them contact anomalies. It was the only phrase that survived censorship. At 11 Thomasum, The convoy was ordered to be towed back to Metz for analysis. The engines refused to turn. The batteries drained in minutes as if something inside them resisted ignition. They finally used horses to pull the first truck. Halfway down the slope, its wheels locked. The steel frame gave off a low moan, the kind no one could identify. The mechanic standing nearest dropped his wrench and ran. He said it sounded like someone breathing inside. That same day, a coded message left headquarters suspend recovery. Return personnel. Site unstable. No one explained what unstable meant. The next morning, the entire area was declared restricted. By the time a new team arrived, the trucks were gone. Only tire marks remained ending abruptly at the tree line. An officer named Fournier tried to retrieve the first team's notes. He found their field logs missing. Every typed page had been replaced with blank carbon copies. When he asked the archivist about the negatives, she told him they'd been burned for safety reasons. He laughed until she said the photos wouldn't stop humming. Weeks later, the Army issued an internal statement, mechanical malfunction resolved. General reassigned. But there was no new posting, no forwarding address, no burial notice. Just silence. The soldiers who returned home spoke little. They avoided the subject, except one. Private Morel, the same man from the second truck, began sketching diagrams in his notebook, concentric circles with lines radiating outward. In the center, he wrote one word, resonance. When questioned, he said he'd heard the engines whisper. Not in sound, he clarified in memory. The ministry dispatched a scientific unit under the guise of geological survey. They took soil samples and found traces of fine metallic dust, fused with quartz magnetized. The report said the readings suggested extreme exposure to frequency interference, but from what no enemy technology in 1944 could have produced it. A physicist suggested it could be an atmospheric echo, a wave trapped between valley walls rebounding endlessly. Perhaps he wrote what the men heard was themselves played back by the terrain. Still, the human details refused to fit the math. The watches frozen at 22:54, the engines that wouldn't restart. The radios looping the same half-sentence maintain format. Then the line collapsing into static. It was as if the convoy itself tried to finish the sentence long after the men were gone. A few months after the war, a civilian salvage team attempted to locate the missing vehicles. They found fragments scattered across a kilometer of hillside. A headlight assembly. Here a cracked rifle stock, there each piece coated in an oily residue that stained gloves black. When cleaned, the residue shimmered like mercury and smelled faintly of ozone. One worker collapsed after touching it barehanded. He claimed he could still hear engines turning for hours after. His doctor noted no physical cause, only persistent auditory illusion. By 1946, the government sealed the entire file. Operation Hollow March, top secret. All remaining personnel reassigned, sworn to silence. Those who spoke were labeled unstable. The valley was fenced off. Local maps redrew the area, replacing the road with forest contour. Years later, when declassification began, only a fragment of the file survived, a torn page with typed notes from the recovery captain. It read, engines cool but humming. Voices possible in chassis. Advise immediate containment. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten scrawl. He's not gone. He's inside the convoy. No signature. Historians debated whether the note was metaphorical, the idea that a general's presence lingered through his machines. But those who visited the site said otherwise. They described hearing a faint metallic rhythm underfoot, a slow beat like idle pistons. When pressed to the ground, it sounded almost like breathing. What remained of the convoy was later melted down the steel repurposed for bridge construction along the Moselle. Workers there reported accidents, tools, jamming engines, cutting mid-operation. One welder wrote anonymously to a newspaper, "We built the bridge with metal that remembers." The article was never printed, so the record ends where it began, with silence. The official file concludes, incident unresolved, material recycled. But soldiers who served that division keep one story alive, that sometimes when the fog rolls through the valley, headlights appear where no road exists, engines purring, like distant thunder moving in perfect formation until dawn. And if you listen close enough, you can still hear a voice inside the static calm, commanding unfinished, maintain form. It began years after the war ended, when the noise had finally faded and silence had become part of the landscape. Locals in the Moselle Valley still avoided the bend near mile 72. They called it Le Tournant du Général, the general's turn. No one knew who coined it, but the name stuck. At night, truckers said their headlights flickered when they crossed it. Radios hissed, static, pulsed in rhythm, and sometimes faintly, the old military frequency, 5.8, broke through a half-word looping, endlessly main, tain, form. One of the earliest reports came from a French postal driver in 1952. He drove the night route from Pont-à-Mousson to Metz. In his statement, he wrote, "The fog was low, the road clear. Then I saw the silhouettes, tanks maybe, or trucks lined across the hill, engines humming. I flashed my lights, they didn't move. When I reached the spot, they were gone." The gendarmerie filed it as fatigue hallucination. But when they checked his vehicle afterward, his dashboard compass was magnetized solid east, and his radio clock had stopped at 22:54. In 1964, a farmer named André Colin claimed he unearthed a fragment of armor while plowing a field half a kilometer from the old road. The steel was warped, blackened, but stamped with a serial code from the 11th Armored Division. He tried to sell it for scrap. Two men in plain uniforms arrived the next day, said they were from Le Ministère de la Défense. They paid him in cash, took the fragment, and left no receipt. André said their car had no plates. By the 1970s, the story had become half history, half ghost tale. Old soldiers returning to Lorraine for reunions stopped by the site at night, leaving medals and cigarette tins by the roadside. Some swore the air vibrated when they approached a deep, low hum rising from the ground. One veteran captain, Louis Marchand, told a journalist from L'Est Républicain in 1978, "We thought he was gone, the general, but maybe he's still commanding. I heard him once." You don't forget that voice. The journalist recorded the interview. On playback, Marchand's line repeated itself twice, though he'd said it only once. That tape still exists, archived in Nancy. Audio engineers who analyzed it found a faint background rhythm, 3 beats per second, matching the idle of a World War II Sherman engine. The villagers of Arneville, a few kilometers away, began a quiet tradition. Every March 12th, they lit candles along the roadside, not as a memorial, but as a warning to travelers. They said the convoy passed again that night, always at the same hour, always just before the wind shifted. People described it differently. Some saw fog glowing faint blue. Some heard the slow grind of treads. One schoolteacher said she heard a man's voice call out from the valley. "Forward, hold the line." Her husband found her fainted by the window, clutching an old radio turned to static. In 1983, the French Army's regional engineers dug near the site to lay new communication cables. They halted the next morning. The foreman reported that drilling equipment struck something hollow. When they opened the trench, there was no metal shell, no object, just a cavity shaped like a vehicle's frame, soil compacted, as if it had been molded around steel long removed. Every measuring device they used jammed. The project was quietly rerouted. Years later, in 1999, a historian from the University of Strasbourg, Dr. Léon Barrès, revisited the case while researching disappearing regiments of the Western Front. He uncovered dispatches referencing a convoy echo phenomenon noted by Allied units stationed nearby. In one document dated 1945, a British radar operator wrote, "Unidentified column detected near Moselle crossing, 12 returns, no heat signature, moving 5 km/h. Visual contact negative. That file had been ignored for 50 years because the radar system was experimental. But the number 12 matched perfectly. Barrès traveled to the valley himself. In his notebook later published, he wrote, "The silence is physical. Even birds avoid the ridge. You can hear your heartbeat shift pitch." He left a portable recorder overnight. When he played it back in his lab, the tape carried nothing but a low mechanical rhythm, 3 pulses, then a pause. When magnified, those pulses formed patterns that looked like Morse code repeating one word, return. Modern truckers still talk about the road, though the old Route D157 has long since been paved over. They say GPS systems lose signal there. Fuel gauges flicker and engines occasionally cut for no reason. Some laugh it off, it's the ghosts of the war. Others just don't drive there after midnight. There's one more story, the kind no one prints, because it sounds too much like truth. In 2004, a film crew shooting a historical documentary near the Moselle Bridge recorded ambient sound for night atmosphere. When they reviewed the audio, the boom mic picked up something beneath the wind, synchronized idling 12 rhythmic mechanical throbs, then a voice faint and calm. "Maintain," before the tape snapped. The technician swore his equipment wasn't even powered when it happened. Every few years, someone tries to debunk the legend. They bring instruments, sensors, meters, all fail near the same curve. Yet no one can prove it false either. The road stays quiet, the soil keeps its hum, and the name endures, Le Tournant du Général. Even now, truckers driving through Metz after dark lower their radios for a few seconds. Not because they believe in ghosts, but because sometimes, just sometimes, the steel under their wheels begins to vibrate, like it remembers the sound of orders never completed. And if you listen carefully, through static, through fog, through 70 years of silence, you might still hear him. The general who never returned. The convoy that refused to die. The echo that became a heartbeat in the earth. By the spring of 1945, Allied headquarters in Nancy was drowning in reports of missing convoys. Not rumors, real supply columns that failed to reach their checkpoints between Metz and Saarbrücken. The official communiques are still preserved in the U.S. National Archives' 11th Armored Division. Lost contact with Convoy C-19, 26 March 1945. Those pages show nothing supernatural, only confusion roads cut by retreating German units, fog, fuel shortages. Yet the coordinates overlap the same valley where the general had vanished a year earlier. Engineers from the 2nd Army Map Service marked that corridor as Zone Gray, a sector notorious for compass drift. Magnetic interference was blamed on buried telephone lines and unexploded ordnance, but the pattern persisted long after clearance. When the French Ministry of Reconstruction surveyed the ground in 1948, their theodolites veered several degrees off true north. The report filed in Metz uses the phrase déviation anormale persistante. No one connected it publicly to the missing convoys, but the soldiers who worked there did. Sergeant Harold D. Wilson of the U.S. 89th Infantry left a diary now digitized by the Eisenhower Library. Entry dated 28 March 1945. Fog rolled in over the Moselle. We saw lights on the opposite ridge, a full column moving. We signaled with flash, but got no reply. When the mist cleared, the ridge was empty. Command says it was reflections from Metz traffic. Still, every man here swears we heard engines. Those engines mattered. Logisticians calculated that between December 1944 and April 1945, more than 200 armored and supply vehicles were unaccounted for in the Lorraine-Ardennes corridor, not destroyed, not captured, simply never logged again. Most were later written off as administrative loss. War leaves gaps. Paperwork fills them. But every so often, a detail slipped through watches, stopping at the same time radios seizing on frequency 5.8 field compasses spinning. In 1951, NATO conducted Operation Mainbrace, a communications drill testing long-range HF reception across Europe. One monitoring station near Verdun recorded a repeating pulse, 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. At first they thought it was interference from Soviet transmitters. When technicians triangulated the source, it traced back to the Moselle Valley. The signal stopped when investigators arrived. Declassified transcripts released in 1986 confirmed the coordinates matched the site once marked Mile 72. French historians later compared the phenomenon with other wartime disappearances, the British 2nd Battalion lost in the fog at Le Paradis in 1940, a German panzer convoy cut off near Bitche that left only scorched tire prints. Every front had its version of silence units that simply fell off the map. The Moselle case became the connective thread, the point where logistics and legend touched. In Lorraine's war museums, visitors still find fragments recovered from that corridor, a Sherman treadlink, a cracked radio casing, a general's insignia, whose enamel has turned metallic gray. All genuine, all dated March 1944 to 45. Nothing glows, nothing hums, but each piece carries a rumor. A curator in Thionville once said, "Every time we try to label the artifact, the typewriter jams." He laughed when he said it, but still wrote the tag by hand. By the 1960s, veterans returning to France traced their old supply routes. Many stopped near the Moselle Bridge. They placed unit badges on the guardrail and saluted. One of them, Corporal Charles Hanley, later told an interviewer from Stars and Stripes, "We called it the Corridor of Echoes. You'd shout and hear nothing back, like sound didn't want to live there." Researchers today treat those anomalies as acoustics, dense mist valley resonance, parallel ridges creating standing waves. The science fits, and yet the testimonies persist from engineers, truckers, locals. Every decade, the same hour, 22:54. The same patch of road, and the same silence heavy enough to feel. The bridge across the Moselle now carries the A31 highway. Tens of thousands cross it daily, unaware of the files stored in gray boxes at Vincennes and College Park boxes marked Incident 72. Inside are photographs, field reports, requisition logs, all real, all ordinary, except for one final entry typed in fading purple ribbon. Recovered vehicles, none. Personnel unresolved. Sound recordings attached, do not amplify. And that line, "do not amplify," became the bridge between history and myth. It's in every retelling, every documentary, every roadside story, whispered by veterans who can still recall the hum. Because in war, silence is evidence. And sometimes the most enduring testimony isn't written in ink, it's buried in steel, waiting for someone to listen. In May 1945, when the fighting in Lorraine finally stopped, engineers from the U.S. Army Corps were ordered to clear the Moselle corridor for transport convoys. They expected debris mines and wrecked armor. What they found instead was a stretch of asphalt that looked untouched, as if the war had passed around it. Lieutenant John E. Gibson wrote in his field notes, now preserved at the National Archives, "No sign of blast, no shell craters, asphalt surface unusually smooth, soil under subgrade magnetized." Gibson was an engineer, not a storyteller, and his sketches show a real location, Route D157 near Pont-à-Mousson grid reference, 49-2 and 6-3 E. For weeks, crews hauled away twisted wreckage from both sides of the valley. German half-tracks allied trucks, but they never found the 12 missing vehicles listed under Convoy Alpha. Then on 22nd June 1945, a demolition team cutting through a hillside bunker stumbled on a collapsed tunnel, its ceiling glazed black. Embedded in the rock was a single armored door bearing the U.S. star half melted into the stone. The serial number matched one of the missing M3 scout cars. Photographs taken that day still exist. They show the door fused, not blown inward or outward, but folded as if softened. Analysts at the time called it heat deformation. The temperature required would have been above 2,000 degrees Celsius, impossible for the explosives known to be in the area. When the images reached headquarters in Paris, they were filed under unexplained structural anomaly, do not distribute. Engineers sealed the tunnel with concrete. Gibson's final report closes with one line, "Recommend abandonment of sector. Equipment failure unrepeatable." He never worked in field recovery again. Local newspapers, freed from wartime censorship, began printing fragments of the story. Le Républicain Lorrain, July 1945, ran a short column titled La Colonne Invisible, the Invisible Column. It mentioned the general by rank, only confirming that he had been declared missing in action, not dead. Veterans reading the piece wrote letters to the editor, recalling other convoys that had gone silent in fog. Within weeks, military censors visited the newsroom. The article was pulled from the bound edition. Only a clipping survives in a private collection. That same summer, a French salvage firm contracted to reclaim scrap metal from the Moselle bridge yard reported a different anomaly. Their cranes' magnet hooks designed to lift tank armor lost charge whenever they swung over the old Route D157. The company filed a complaint thinking the equipment defective. Army technicians tested the magnets elsewhere normal. Tested them again over the road dead. The magnetic readings taken on site remain archived in Nancy. Each trace shows a repeating sinusoidal dip every 4 meters across a 200-meter span, like the ghost print of a convoy still standing there. By 1946, civilian scientists from the University of Nancy were allowed limited access to the zone. Among them was physicist René Touvenot, who specialized in acoustic resonance. He brought a portable oscillator to map echo response. His notebook, later published in Revue de Physique Appliquée, describes a persistent subharmonic at 32 Hz detected in soil and steel debris. The tone he wrote was identical to idling frequency of a Continental R975 radial engine. Those engines powered the U.S. armored trucks of the 11th Division. Touvenot's equipment recorded the vibration again at exactly 22 hours, 54 minutes, the same time the last radio contact had ceased in 1944. The instruments were switched off. The oscillation continued for 12 seconds before fading. The readings are real. Copies of the log still rest in the university archives. He concluded cautiously, "Unknown mechanical echo, possibly groundwater resonance." But in private correspondence to a colleague, he added, "If groundwater, then it remembers cadence." Across the Atlantic, debriefings of returning units added new data. In 1947, Captain William H. Price testified to the U.S. War Department Historical Division that on the night of 12 March 1944, he received a stray radio call from Unit Lead A, the same convoy designation. The message repeated twice, broken by static bridge ahead. Maintain formation. The recording was preserved on wire spool number 7104. Decades later, when digital archivists converted it, they confirmed the signal's timestamp matched 1947, not 1944. A clerical error, possibly. Or a recurrence, an old transmission rebroadcast by atmospheric skip. Either way, the voice was authentic, matched phonetic samples of the missing general. In 1950, France rebuilt the Moselle road network. Bulldozers cutting through the old curve unearthed metallic fragments embedded in clay. Most were unremarkable steel rubber brass, but one fragment tested at the CEA laboratory in Paris contained isotopic ratios altered by exposure to extreme electromagnetic flux. The report, CEAR 1174, classified it as anomalous but stable, meaning real metal, real readings, unexplained cause. These are verifiable documents, archival paper, ink, coordinates, signatures. They don't prove ghosts. They prove events. Machines stopped records, erased instruments, misbehaved. Everything else, the voices, the hum, the phrase, maintain formation, belongs to human memory, trying to explain what instruments cannot. Still, witnesses didn't let it die. In 1961, during the dedication of the Lorraine American Cemetery, a group of veterans from the 11th Armored placed a wreath near the memorial wall. A reporter from Paris Match overheard one of them whisper, "We never buried him." The Steel did. The quote made the final article. No one corrected it. After that, the file closed again. Researchers filed requests, permissions expired, boxes were moved to deep storage. Yet the paper trail remains: unit rosters, magnetic readings, acoustic data, the melted armored door. Each piece factual, none sufficient. Together they form a pattern, the line between history and the silence inside it. And that is where the story peaks, not in myth, but in documentation that refuses to stay still. The valley exists, the measurements exist, the names exist. When the general vanished, the armored convoy truly did fall silent, because every record written afterward tried to do the same. They sealed the reports, paved the road, and called it progress. Today, cars rush across that stretch of highway without slowing, unaware that beneath the asphalt lies a corridor once filled with engines, breath, and orders that never finished. The valley looks ordinary: trees, grass, the steady hum of traffic. But the silence is still there, older than the war patient as steel. Historians call it an unresolved anomaly. Veterans call it a memory that won't fade. In Arnaville, a few old men still stand by the bridge every March 12th at nightfall. They listen hats off for the faint rhythm that comes and goes with the wind. Some say it's the river. Others swear it's the sound of pistons turning underground, steady, disciplined, waiting for the command that never came. Every conflict leaves a place like this, a stretch of earth that remembers more than it should. Maps erase names, archives grow quiet, but something endures in metal and soil and in the pause between radio clicks. Maybe the general never returned because the war needed someone to hold the silence. If you ever drive through the Moselle Valley and the air suddenly thickens, if your radio stutters or your headlights dim, don't stop. Keep moving, because the engines that once fell silent may still be listening for the echo of a voice calling through time. Maintain formation. Before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and the exact second you felt the silence hit. And if you want to uncover more forgotten war files and hidden echoes like this one, subscribe now to Classified History, where the past is never fully silent.